Good morning. I want to talk to you today about the 52nd Foot at Waterloo. You might be thinking, is there anything new to say? Well, I've been doing quite a lot of further delving into the history of what went on with the 52nd, because clearly you get involved in quite a major argument, you would say, in time regarding who defeats the Imperial Guard and what goes on with regarding that. But there's lots of different aspects to what they did at Waterloo, and therefore with the fact that I actually was recently made aware of some additional sort of information that has not come to light before and has not been published, decided to delve into this subject again. Because some of you may well have known or know already that, in fact, about 5 years ago, I did a book on the 2nd Division, that's Clinton's division, which they belong to. And you might be thinking, well, has he got anything else to write about the subject? Well, actually, the truth is, yes, quite a lot now. And in fact, some of that book I would have to rewrite if I was doing it today, because of the fact that some of this new information has come out. But let's just start talking about it anyway. Obviously, the 52nd Foot, we've already heard from Sue, was a very renowned regiment, probably second, probably to, if that, to the 95th. So for fame, etc. And a couple of things extra I've just add in from what Sue said about Sir John Moore, who was obviously a colonel for quite a while. Just interesting to note that some of the officers who actually had some connection with the regiment in their early days says it was actually interesting how Moore had started recruiting officers from the Scottish hierarchy, should we say, as high up as possible. So basically, he was trying to make the regiment second to the Guards in regard to the place to put your son if you were the Lord or whatever. And it's interesting how he managed to do that, and he recruited very much from those Scottish backgrounds. And in fact, the general infantry, the rankers as well, flooded into his regiment because at that time it was almost seen as a Scottish regiment because of his being born in Glasgow, and that sort of encouraged people to actually volunteer to join his regiment. And of course, later on, there is Sir John Colborne gets involved as well, another renowned character. So let's talk a little bit about this regiment and what was going on. One of the things that often comes up about the 52nd is their excellence. And it's comments like this. These are just randomly picked from a number of different publications, etc. But you can see elite troops, expertly led, superb infantry. It's the standard sort of stuff that you hear from both the 95th and the 52nd. And when I started doing a bit of this sort of discussion and looking into these different sort of troops, I realized that there were a number of things that perhaps didn't really fit with this image. And I suppose, let's be realistic, any regiment is perhaps not as superb as they'd like to be. And in fact, clearly after the War of 1814, with some people retiring, etc., things had changed. And it's something I want to bring into the subject as we go forward. But before I go into depth with regard to them, the first thing we have to know is where the actual two battalions of the 52nd were in early 1815. The first battalion was in UK. It actually returned from Spain. But I'll talk about the second battalion first. The second battalion was already in Belgium. It had been involved in 1814 with Thomas Graham in places like the success, he says, of Bergen-op-Zoom, and therefore had remained as part of the British troops in Belgium after the end of the war. And there were only about 270 odd men in the ranks, so a very, very weak battalion. At the same time, you had the first battalion, as I said, in England, and they had been ordered with other troops to sail to America. So they moved to Ireland, all collected at Cork Harbour, and then eventually set off in January towards the US. For this story, it's their luck, in a sense, that on two occasions, the weather was so appalling in the Atlantic that they were driven back to Cork Harbour to get safety again. And on the second time they arrived back, they arrived to find orders actually there to countermand their move to America, because news of Napoleon having escaped from Elba and arriving back on the French throne had already arrived, and they were now on their road to Belgium. Now, one of the things I want to mention is that obviously we have a large number of memoirs from the 52nd, but actually this is something that's quite new, in fact, because I was struck that with regard to the 95th, there are dozens of actual memoirs already published and available. But in fact, actually with the 52nd, it's not been the same. It's not been true until recently. It's only recently that a number of theirs have appeared. We obviously have people like Sir John Colborne, who obviously led the regiment during the actual campaign, and he wrote a number of letters. How unfortunately, he is one of these people who his words have to be treated very carefully. He admits himself, didn't write anything down after the battle, and didn't write anything about the battle for 10, 15 years later. And if you read his numerous letters over the next 30 years, they vary quite a lot. And in fact, the story he gives varies quite a lot. So you have to be very careful in how you actually interpret what he says. You cannot be just taken at his word. Charles Rowan, Patrick Campbell, who unfortunately I can't find a picture of, were published by Cyborn as well. So we got a couple of letters from them in there. And then you get people like Gawler, who decided in the 1830s to write an article or two on the claims of the 52nd to have beaten the Imperial Guard, and was roundly attacked by the establishment and a number of other officers quite quickly, and had to sort of backtrack a little bit and sort of accept a sort of a midway ground between what he'd originally claimed and what they were saying. William Young was actually also wrote some bits and pieces. He actually sort of records some extra bits and pieces about Sir John Colborne himself. I'm actually not sure if you're aware, but Gawler, Young, and Leake, whom I'm about to mention, were all relatives in some form or other of Sir John Colborne. So it was a bit of a family business going on here. But Young's information is not so easy to find. But Ensign Leake then wrote a very large book on the history of the 52nd at Waterloo, some 40 years after the battle, and also admitting that he hadn't written any notes at the time and didn't write them down till a good 10 years or so after the battle. Now, Ensign Leake obviously is a good source. He has some good information in there, but you also have to be very careful with him, because he clearly is writing this book with an actual aim. He has taken up the gauntlet from Gawler and wants to prove that the 52nd beat the Guard, the Imperial Guard, and that nobody else did. And that's the issue with him, is it's not a case just of the 52nd were involved, but they did everything. Nothing else was done by anybody else virtually. And in some ways, that is where his account starts to fail, because clearly other battalions and regiments, etc., had something to do with this occasion. We also have a number of letters from Henry Clinton, which I've published in the recent past. Frederick Adams got a few letters, and we've got an account by Charles Shaw, who was actually there as well. Although he didn't actually fight at Waterloo itself, he actually was on the baggage party up in Brussels. But apart from that, he has a good account of the general period. But when I was looking to sort of work on this account, some new accounts came to my knowledge. We found that Captain William Rowan, that's Charles's brother, had actually written his own account of the actual whole campaign, and that is actually in the Museum of the Oxford Soldier. I found Lieutenant John Hart's letters to his wife, which were written at the time of the Waterloo Campaign, to his wife. They're in the National Army Museum. But the most important by far, and the main reason why it's been allowed me to go a lot further into the history of the 52nd, is the fact that I found hiding on display in the actual Rifles Museum in Winchester, and therefore not worked on by anybody because it was on display and hadn't been allowed out of display, Lieutenant Charles Holman's journal, which is the only 52nd account I have yet to find that was written daily at the time of the incident. Very contemporary. So he's writing literally the day after Waterloo, what had happened, etc. So that is really important to us and really helps us a lot with our understanding, and you'll see that as we go along. Now, the first thing that happens is when the 1st Battalion finally arrives in Belgium, they receive orders that, in fact, they have to reorganize, and the fit soldiers from the 2nd Battalion were to move into the 1st Battalion to strengthen it. And as you can see by the arrows here, this is the 2nd Battalion. Went across to the 1st Battalion is 1 officer, 9 sergeants, and 224 rank and file. The officer is Shaw, the chap who was talking about, so he only appeared because of this transfer. But it was the whole point of this exchange was to actually bolster the actual battalion strength that was going to be in Belgium. Now, there is something strange here because, yes, they had to send any weak, ill, sick people who couldn't actually carry out a campaign into the 2nd Battalion to go home with them. But in fact, what happens is 26 sergeants, 8 buglers, and 284 rank and file actually transferred to the 2nd Battalion. Now, that's more by about 70 than actually went from the 2nd Battalion to the 1st. So they've actually weakened the battalion by doing so. However, by the time of Waterloo itself, they were up to about 1,000, but that is from additional troops who had, volunteers who had actually joined the regimental headquarters, were actually sent out in the next month or two before the battle and actually bolstered the actual battalion up to 1,000. Now, you have to look at these figures, and there is something in them that perhaps says an untold story, and it's one I can't completely prove yet, but I want to bring it to your attention. We have a number of sergeants, particularly, who are being moved from the 1st Battalion to the 2nd Battalion. Now, if you read accounts from the end of the 1814 wars, etc., yes, there were lots of people who were able to leave the army because that was the end of, with the end of fighting, that was the end of their sort of signed on period, etc., they could leave. And a lot of accounts finished that way. But there's others who are very clearly staying in the army because that's the only place they can get work as such, and they have to stay in for a longer period. But they're actually very war weary. And in fact, it's something that Bernard Cornwell brings out in his Sharpe's Waterloo. Not one of my favourites of his books, but it actually really does play on this war weariness, and he's definitely picked up something there. And I do wonder if this occasion was an occasion for a number of sergeants to move out to the 1st Battalion, to the 2nd Battalion, which was going home, rather than have to fight another campaign again. Because definitely looking at the sick record, etc., of the regiment, or the 1st Battalion, I should say, there is nothing to indicate that those many sergeants and those many rank and file were actually sick and that ill that they couldn't actually serve in this campaign. But it's something that perhaps, hopefully, further research might get some further on it. But I thought I'd bring that to your attention. Now, this is the actual Waterloo map. Obviously, there's Brussels, Waterloo's here. But obviously, when everything starts and the French come up from Charleroi up towards Quatre Bras and towards Ligny on the 15th, the 52nd are out in Adams' brigade, sat here, not too far from Ath. And Clinton is in charge of this division at Ath, and Hill is at Enghien because he actually commands the corps. On the 15th, nothing happens. They have no indication of anything, but there is something strange that goes on because we know of the famous ball going on at Brussels that night. And yet Clinton, Adam and Hill all choose not to go to the actual ball. They actually feel that there's enough tensions on the border that they don't feel safe to be able to away from their troops. And in fact, the only people that actually go that were invited from this group of officers here is actually that Hill's 2 ADCs go for the night and then have to ride back very early the following morning. But other than that, none of them go. When we get to the 16th, the first thing that happens in the morning is they clearly still have no idea anything's going on. And the brigade, the light brigade, is actually ordered ready to move to Quiver Camp, which is actually an area down here, a little village, and there was some large pasturage areas nearby where they were regularly going and actually doing field exercises, etc. Henry Clinton was a great man for field exercises, parades, and constant checking people's equipment and everything, and arms, etc. He never stopped. And for this reason, more than any other, he was loathed by virtually every officer in the army that had anything to do with him, because they couldn't stand all the constant checking and redoing. But that was Clinton. But anyway, they're ordered at 5 a.m. in the morning by Clinton to get ready and to be at Quiver Camp for 9 o'clock. And that would require them to march at about 8 in the morning to get Quiver Camp, because it'll take them an hour or so to get there. So that's what they were doing first in the morning. But before they could actually move off at about 8, via Hill, a message eventually arrives with Clinton at 7 o'clock in the morning to say that the army is required to prepare to march. Now that is the orders given out at 7 p.m. on the night of the 15th, when Wellington first gets an intimation there is a problem at the frontier. And before he actually orders anything to move, he sends out this initial order at 7 p.m. So it is taken from Brussels to via Enghien. It's taken virtually 12 hours to actually get to Ath for Clinton to actually do something with it. Clinton's brigade is division is Adams' brigade just to the southwest. He has the Hanoverian brigade actually in the town, and he has a KGL brigade which is actually situated in villages in this area here. Now when he gets the 7 a.m. Message, he obviously immediately cancels the orders to move to Quiver Camp for the day and to get ready to march. This requires all of his troops to come in as a division at Ath. Now, with regard to the Light Brigade, they have one long delay in this, because although most of the troops are only within an hour and a half march of Ath, the 2nd 95th are all the way over here at Mons. And they have got a 2.5 hour journey to catch up to the rest of the actual brigade. So the orders go out, it gets down to them, and they start their march back. But of course, this brigade doesn't move without them. Clinton, while he's waiting for them to arrive, by 10 o'clock receives the second order. This order again has come from Brussels via Enghien to say that now you must march immediately to Enghien, which is actually the corps joining together. This is actually Wellington's second orders sent out about 11 o'clock at night, midnight, finally arriving. So you can see the delays involved in everything. Clinton is obviously now by 10 o'clock thinking, where are my troops? I need these other brigades to arrive. And he holds, but at 1 o'clock, he can't hold any longer. By that stage, he's only got 2 of the 4 battalions of the KGL who have arrived at Ath, and there's still no sign of Adams' brigade. He therefore orders the troops he has in Ath to begin the march to Enghien. And he orders the 2 battalions that are still on their way to meet him, the KGL battalions, to join him before Enghien. They meet him somewhere by here and they arrive at Enghien together. It is only at 2 p.m., 1 hour after they've left Ath, that the Light Brigade finally arrives at Ath. And of course has orders immediately to continue to catch up with the rest of the division at Enghien. But while they're marching to Enghien, we've actually already got the situation where Clinton has received another order. This order says, when you get to Enghien, don't stop, but keep marching. And this time it's across country. As you can see, there's no major road here, to Braine-le-Comte. So he arrives there with the first set of troops. In fact, the Light Brigade virtually catch up with them at Enghien. So by the time they're all together at about 5 in the evening, 1700, they literally have about a 30-minute break. Leake says a 3-hour break, but it's clearly his memory messing around with him, because nobody else says that. Everyone says it was literally a 20 to 30-minute break. We just got a small ration of rum was given to us and some biscuit. We ate that and we left. And they then started marching again. So by 5:30 at the latest, they're actually on the march across these country lanes to Braine-le-Comte. And because this is obviously a much more difficult journey, not on major roads, it's actually 11 o'clock at night before they arrive there. When they arrive there, Clinton has already received another order to move on without delay to Nivelles. Again, which from this direction will be across country roads. So Clinton believes, obviously having had such a long day of marching already, that they actually need some rest. So they arrive at 2300 hours, and he says that in 3 hours' time, we will march again. So there are some who actually manage to go and try and find some food. Most people appear to have actually just found a space in a field and just collapsed and tried to get some rest for 3 hours. Leake, I find quite interesting, as he actually goes into the actual inn that's there, finds a number of officers of the 71st Foot already in there. They must have got there ahead of him and have already fallen asleep in the only beds available. And he just joins one of them and actually sleeps with him for the next 3 hours, apparently without disturbing him, gets back up again at 2 o'clock and carries on the march. Anyway, they then take on the march again across country and eventually arrive at Nivelles at 0700 hours. So by this stage, they have effectively been marching for the best part of 24 hours with small gaps in between. When they arrive at Nivelles, they have already again, Clinton's already again had another order, this time to march to Quatre Bras. This is because this order has been placed while Wellington is just finishing the day. He actually says that obviously he's going to face the French again the following day, because he has no idea that the Prussians have been beaten at Ligny and have actually retreated to Wavre. So the first orders is that they're going to do that. So at 7 o'clock in the morning, they've arrived. By 8 o'clock, they start the march towards Quatre Bras. And the first brigade to move are the KGL brigade, and they start marching down this road and get about halfway. The others were a bit delayed in actually starting. We're about to follow behind them when the next order arrives from Wellington, which is to say that we're not standing at Quatre Bras anymore, because obviously he's found out that the Prussians have moved, and we're now going to meet at Mont Saint-Jean. So the poor old KGL chaps have to march all the way back to Nivelles, and Clinton is told to march at 10 o'clock on this road directly to Mont Saint-Jean from Nivelles. Now, the troops are ready to march at 10 o'clock, but they've got no chance of being able to do so. The first thing is that Nivelles is actually the site of the Dutch-Belgian hospital station for all those troops that have been wounded at Quatre Bras. They've been shipped here overnight. So they had to all be put into wagons and set off on the road. Now, you'd have thought they'd have probably sent them up towards Brussels to be out of the way and safe. In fact, unfortunately, the Dutch-Belgians make the decision to actually send them up to Braine-l'Alleud, which is actually, and put them in the church there. Now, Braine-l'Alleud, like Mont-Saint-Jean Farm, were the two hospital stations for the army during the Battle of Waterloo. Mont-Saint-Jean wasn't used at all, so that was nice and empty, ready to go. But Braine-l'Alleud Church, unfortunately, during the Battle of Waterloo, was already pretty well full of all the wounded, from Dutch-Belgian wounded who had come from Quatre Bras. So not ideal. But anyway, they led off to start with. And then it was also found that there were hundreds of wagons, store wagons, in this area as well. The commissary had got masses of wagons here. They had to make up their way up the road as well. And it was only then, after that, that the division could start marching up here. And in fact, they didn't start marching till about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, with constant halts all the way along, because obviously the slow moving transport up ahead, they had to make sure that they were there to stop anything happening. And there was stuff happening, because the French sent cavalry from Quatre Bras, not just up this way after the British as they retreated through Genappe, but they also sent cavalry this way. And they come up on Clinton's troops marching towards Mont-Saint-Jean here. Now, the 52nd don't mention any strong fighting, but clearly at times the actual cavalrymen managed to get round them and maneuver around them. And in fact, I have a report which I found of a commissary who actually was captured, and actually says that over 100 wagons were captured on this road. So clearly the division didn't manage to stop everything being attacked. But the rest managed to get through safely. And finally, the division arrived in the area of Meurbe-Braine in the rear of the Allied army, which ranges in front of Mont-Saint-Jean here. Now, I'm only going to mention this very briefly because if anybody knows these returns, these are the returns you'll see in Q, where they've actually got the sort of pay returns for every sort of regiment, etc. This is a page from the 52nd at Waterloo. And you can see, if I pick out anybody, this is Private Henry Holland. You can see he's in number 9 company. Okay? That does not mean he is in number 9 company on the battlefield. And I'm not going to go into great detail about that today now, because I've done a podcast on it for the Waterloo Association. And if you would like to go to the listen to the podcast, which explains it properly for a good 10 minutes, you're welcome to. But this is the brief version now. Basically, if you look at the left-hand column here now, you end up with a situation where from the muster list I've just shown you, at the back of that, every 3 months, they would show the officers. So that chap we mentioned just now was in number 9 company. That is James Love's company. And therefore, you can actually say that he was in Love's company. There is no question about that. What you can't say is he was in number 9 company on the battlefield, because the actual line companies, as you can see, are very different to what's on this column here for the muster lists. The muster lists were actually done by seniority and are very much, they were stated they had to be done by seniority, and they are very much just an administrative number. They're not the numbers they fought in. And as you can see, and in fact, there are some recent books that actually say, for example, that Anderson commanded number 10 company, which would have been the light company if it was a normal battalion. But he did not. He commanded number 5, and that's 100% certain. And as you can see at the bottom of the page, therefore, I've marked them out as they would stand on the battlefield, with Diggle on the right, Shedden commanding on the left. Rowan and Chalmers, we know were in the left wing, but I have not been able to establish which way round they had number 7 and 6, and the same with Langton and Love. They had 2 and 3. What I will say here, if you see there's a couple of names that are dark blacked with some brackets underneath, This Dawson was in charge of Patrick Campbell's company for almost the entire battle until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when Patrick Campbell deemed to turn up. He was on leave in Brussels, presumably, and turned up at 5 o'clock in the afternoon to took over the battle just before everything happened at the end of the day. Robert Campbell was also on leave, but didn't turn up at all. So you can see John Crass commanded. Robert Brownrigg was still officially commanding a company, but was in the Far East, having a new appointment. So Lieutenant Anderson, the adjutant, took his position, and George Young was acting as ADC to Adam. So therefore Langton commanded his. Luckily, the 52nd had 3 extra captains, and they were able to step into 3 of the 4 positions, and then Anderson took the last one. As you can see also that Dawson, as I said, had to take over as a lieutenant until the occasion. Now, you can only get these names and which companies they were in if they're in people's memoirs, etc. That's all we can do. They're not in official documents anywhere. I've checked. And as you can see, the other officers who are attached to the companies, I can only tell you these because these people tell you, or people tell me they're in these companies. The others are blank because I don't know. And we have no official documents to tell you which companies each officer served in. Then you cannot go by the registers. Anyway, if you want more on that in the longer detail, you can go elsewhere for the podcast. Now, what I want to talk to you here is, please don't read the whole thing, but this is a report from Clinton, who really was a stickler for everything in these regiments. And this is from middle of April, just after they've done the mix of the 2 battalions and put them together. 2nd Battalion have gone off to Britain again. As you can see, there are 9 captains. There was hardly an officer who would account for any deficiency, that's of kit, etc. But they are so used to being applauded that anything like inquiry excites only surprise or even displeasure. So this is Clinton saying a little bit about they think they're a little bit better than they are. He then actually, I've taken a single phrase out of this because he really goes to town in this phrase. Altogether, this regiment lately, the pattern of the English army, has now more the appearance of the remains of a good system than the present possession of one. Now, clearly, they have just amalgamated 2 battalions. So there's always the question of, you've got to give a little bit of leeway there. But unfortunately, Clinton was not a man that gives any leeway on any subject. The rules and the regulations are there. You fail them, and he will do you for it. But it does indicate that the 52nd may have dropped a little bit in its standards since the actual Peninsular War. There's been a year since. There's a number of people will have retired, gone out to the army for other reasons. There are lots of experienced sergeants, etc., and rankers who have just transferred into the 2nd Battalion and gone home. So all of these things will have actually affected the actual battalion, and there are some signs of this as we go on. Now, I want to show you these very, very briefly because this is Leake's version of the the cavalry attacks basically, and the squares out in front. Now, as you can see from Leake, one of the things about Leake is he very much wants to actually show that they were very, very far out into what we would class as no man's land between the two armies. All of the actual other officers, and in fact all of the histories of every other regiment, indicate that the 71st were actually around the corner of this wing here of the back of the orchard, and then the others ran off in this direction from here. Leake clearly has them way further than that. I mean, and the 71st here are actually almost at the point of where we get beyond the orchard. Yes, they were being peppered from the orchard, but not to that extent. That's a lot further forward than in reality. But he does this in all of them. If you look at his version of the defeat of the Imperial Guard, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a little while, as you can see, they're on their own. The 95th stay behind. The 71st stay behind. Just the 1 battalion on its own goes way out and turns against this claimed 10,000 infantry. As you can see, 1 battalion of 1,000 men, or just under 1,000 men, against 10,000. In here, this point here, it makes it quite remarkable they actually did such a thing. They didn't. And then in the final advance, we have the 52nd having moved across here to attack some squares of the Guard, and you'll see that the 71st, who were actually in the same brigade, have been pushed over here. So again, Leake is actually saying we did this on our own, one battalion against the world. Now, Cyborn had the problem of trying to sort this all out. He tried to do it in his own situation. He'd had reports from the guards saying they'd been involved with them and others, and obviously was trying to make sense of it all. Now, if I can just explain this one slightly, this is actually after the defeat of the 1st Imperial Guard column here, which has been defeated by the guards, according to Cyborn, and they're on the retreat. A 2nd column comes in, which is then supposedly attacked in front by Maitland, because they claim they did, and then Adams' brigade come in on their left flank. Now, this is what I want to talk about more again, but you can see different people trying to explain the whole attack in different ways to try and make sense of what everyone is claiming, basically. So let's go back very briefly to the 52nd during this day. The first thing that I'll say is this is Merv Brain at the back in black there, and you can see that for the majority of the day, from 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, right the way through till about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they're in this reserve position with the actual Duplat's KGL brigade towards the front and the guns, the Light Brigade in the middle, and the Hanoverians further back towards Merv Brain. But one thing that does happen is that, in fact, a number of companies, both a company from the 95th and one from the 52nd, are actually ordered to Merv Brain in the morning to actually set it up as a defence. And I find this quite interesting because the engineers were also ordered to actually come to Merv Brain and get it ready for defence. The reason for this, and I've brought this up before, but I'll just mention it very briefly here, is I haven't shown it on here, but there are lots of lanes from here moving north through the actual woods behind them. Merv Brain was clearly going to be defended as far as Wellington was concerned, in the case of a defeat. And it would hold the French back while the army went through these lanes behind it through the woods. The engineering officer failed to turn up, and his battalion actually didn't get the orders to do so because he didn't turn up. That's a different story, but at the end of the day, it meant that Merv Brain didn't get sort of prepared, ready for the fighting, and in fact these troops eventually returned to their units before anything happened. So they sat here in the back line, occasionally getting the odd cannonball through them, etc., and taking a few casualties, but in fact half the 52nd appear to have gone to sleep for the rest of the period once they were in position waiting for everything to happen. Now, at 4 o'clock, they get ordered forward, which is around the time when we know that the large French cavalry attacks started. And it seems like the first wave of the cavalry attacks happened before they were ordered forward, around just after 4 o'clock. However, at this period, Wellington actually sends forward a number of troops, including the Light Brigade here. Now, as you can see, what they do is they move into position under Wellington's orders, angling back towards the Allied line, and are added on the end by the 3rd of the 1st Guards as well. So one of those 2 battalions of Maitland's comes forward as well to form this line across here to break the cavalry attacks up before they can get to the gun line and the rest of the squares behind. During this period, the 52nd are in a bit of a dip either side of the lane, which is still there today, which runs off towards La Belle Alliance. They are actually not under heavy artillery fire, but they're taking some skirmishing fire from the French. Some fire from here, and some from a dip over here somewhere where there's a mention of them actually lining this sort of little ditch and firing on. So a company from this goes out, number 5 company, and actually forms skirmishers to sort of drive them away, which they actually managed to do. The 3rd 95th are not used for that at this stage because apparently the officer in command was not keen to go forward. Apparently, that's the words that is used. And the 3rd 95th, because there was only 2 companies of them, actually couldn't form a square, and they hung behind the 71st and the 52nd. And whenever there was cavalry about, they would actually literally lie underneath the bayonets of the squares to stay safe. But the 71st certainly took some fire from the orchard. And in fact, there is quite a lot of evidence to say, and if there's any Scots Guards fans here, they might not like me for this, but there's pretty good evidence the Scots Guards has virtually lost the orchard. They were in the sunken lane at the back. The KGL battalions were brought forward as well. They were brought forward specifically not to fight the cavalry. These were actually brought to bolster up the Scots Guards in the orchard, because the orchard was near to being lost. And in fact, the 2nd KGL actually went in and fought with the guards for the rest of the afternoon. Now, these 2 squares are not under heavy cannon fire because they're actually in a dip. You get the message when you read the accounts of the 71st and the 2nd 95th and the 3rd 1st Guards that, boy, they're taking a lot of cannonballs in, and it's causing huge problems for them. They're taking large losses. Colborne gets a message from Wellington to say you can retire back over the ridge because the cavalry attacks were starting to ease back, and you're obviously taking a bit of a pummeling down there. Colborne gently says, we're okay, we're not taking as much flak as you think we are in this dip. I'm not sure the commanders of his other battalions would have been so happy with him, because at the time, clearly, they were actually getting hurt quite badly. But anyway, they eventually retire. They appear to have retired in squares, and once they had actually arrived back on the ridge, they go back into 4 deep lines, which is what Wellington has actually now ordered the troops to do so. Now, when we get to the Guard attack itself, I have to say with anything like this, there are lots of people who have got lots of different views on this. I know Andrew Fields listened to this, and he'll probably be tutting in the background already, because each of us has our own views of what happened. I have, again, looked at all of the evidence for this book. Again, I've just literally gone through everything again, not remembered anything from the past. I've just gone through every single bit of evidence, and lots of evidence is not even published yet. And I have made some changes to what I thought in the past, but it still largely stands. There appears to have been a first attack, and certainly Napoleon and many French officers say there was a first attack by the chasseurs first. And these are the ones that Maitland and the Guards actually fight. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I've changed. The first thing is, a lot of people say, well, it couldn't have been the chasseurs because, of course, the grenadiers would have gone first, and then the chasseurs, which would have been on their left, would have come second. And I have thought that for a while, but I went back and reread the comments of people. And as we know, General Pettit's account is used quite a lot. But he actually makes it very clear, but this has been missed by everybody, including me in the past, that it was the custom of the old and the middle guard, which obviously was part of it now always march with the left to the head, as in the chasseurs therefore march before the grenadiers. As you can see, it gives an example there. So therefore, when I go back to that screen for a second, as you can see, I have now changed it round. So it's not led by the 1st, 3rd, it's led by the 2nd, 4th, and actually in the opposite order. And there is some discussion about whether the 4th were in 1 or 2 squares. I disagree with Pettit on that one. That's my choice to do so. But, and I'll give you the reasons are in the book. It's too long to go into now. But the first attack goes in at this point, and it actually is about 10 to 15 minutes before another attack comes in, which is the second attack of 2 battalions of grenadiers, with another grenadier battalion sent a little bit later behind them, which doesn't get involved in the attack, but stops in the middle ground here. Now, this attack, you'd think, well, Adam would know all about that. Adam's troops would see it all, etc. It's quite obvious that an awful lot of people are describing the battlefield at this moment as basically a fog of smoke, with all the guns that have been firing and everything that's been going on. It is literally just smoke. many people say you can't see very far. You're lucky if you can see the other end of your battalion. And in fact, some of the 52nd are saying this. So what happens to Maitland's troops a good 200-300 yards to the right, or to the left, sorry, the 50 of Adam, is not surprising that they weren't able to understand what was going on or see it, in fact. But my view then is that, in fact, that it goes on. I'll go past that then. As I said, that attack goes in there. Then a third attack ends up happening because as the chasseurs are pushed back, Maitland's troops push them back down into the valley. There are 3 battalions of guards still around, which is the 2nd, 3rd Guards and 2 chasseurs, including. Sorry, mine's going for a second. The 3 battalions now move up as a defense mechanism against these being forced back. Obviously, they can't see the other attack on the other side because of the this line here, which is actually a watershed that runs down between the 2 valleys either side. So you cannot see that side. These 3 troops move forward. The guards admit that having started chasing these chasseurs, as they call them, grenadiers, down the slope, that in fact they get into trouble because another column appears. This column makes them run back up the hill to form back up along the crest again. And in fact, that is actually how I can explain how the guards have defeated somebody, and it would appear to be more than 1 battalion of guards, as one historian recently has tried to claim, and that Adam has a reasonable number of troops to actually fight, around 2,000 men, etc. I said 2,000, not 10,000. I agree with that. But what I wanted to say to you is, one of the things that people say is, well, you couldn't tell which was which in the battle with all the smoke, etc. I agree. Yes, this is a grenadier. This is an actual chasseur of the period. And as you can see, the first thing you can notice is their guard, because most of them are wearing a blue overcoat, whereas with the rest of the infantry, they're wearing grey. So that would actually help to identify. Clearly, I know not every soldier at this time actually had the correct uniform, but the majority would have been blue, plus obviously the bear skin would give them guard. And hopefully that's why they recognised it. The only thing that really differs them is because obviously nobody at any distance is going to notice the little green epaulets instead of red, and the plumes are not being worn because it's not in battle, you didn't wear them. So in fact, the other thing then is obviously the metal plate on the front of the grenadiers. Now, if you see any copies of these bearskins in any of the actual museums, you'll actually see that the hair on there actually obliterates half of that. It seems to come over that and usually ends up half covering that brass plate. And I would actually say at a couple of 100 yards, I don't think you're even looking to see if it's a brass plate or not. So I can see why the guard just claimed they'd beaten the guard. Yeah, grenadiers or chasseurs. So on this side of the battlefield, the 2nd attack has been defeated. Now, it's been defeated partly by Halkett's troops, who have just about held on, although virtually everybody else in this area, like Vink and Kielmansegg, etc., have retired. Their troops have been pushed back by the guard attack. It seems to be Detmer's troops that arrived that actually turn the balance and actually chase these back, and they say that they actually chase them back to the point where they fall into the orchard of La Haye-Sainte. However, the 1st, 2nd Grenadiers, who should be out in this area, just fall back in support of them. They're still a formed unit, and that helps to stop Detmer's troops charging on beyond that stage. Now we've obviously got the attack on this side. Now, yes, there is the famous movement, but it's famous to us of everybody moving forward at the 52nd and actually doing this 90-degree turn to actually face the side of the French column that's advancing. The main thing about that is that if you read virtually all of the reports that were written at the time of the battle by anybody that saw it, it's just something that happened. It's not seen as a remarkable maneuver. It's not seen as something that's incredible. Colborne had seen this even back as far as Maida. This was done at Maida, and he'd witnessed it. Therefore, it's noticeable that is that thing that this great movement forward and the turn of 90 degrees is seen today sometimes as a really fantastic move. I'm not saying it didn't have a great effect, but it didn't have an effect on the soldiers around him in thinking it was anything remarkable. Now, when the 52nd turn, as you can see, the 2nd 95th were on their left. So in fact, they didn't have to move much at all to fall into line. And in fact, they moved forward with the 52nd virtually in line. I mean, there's a very slight delay only because they have to go through a battery of cannon, whereas the 52nd are below that on the ridge in front. However, the 71st initially makes an error with the orders. And in fact, one officer claims that in fact they even turned facing the rear as if they were going to retire, thinking that's what the order was. It wasn't, obviously. They were quickly corrected and they moved to actually catch up with the 52nd. Some people like Leake tried to claim that they actually were something like 300 to 400 yards behind. Now, if they'd been that far behind, the 52nd would have been out here and the 71st back where they are there. It didn't happen like that. It was about 100 yards at most. And the 3rd 95th, seeing there was a slight gap between the 52nd and the 71st, filled into that gap in the line. And by the time they get to about here, having defeated the guard, and they get to here where the cavalry, they get mixed up with some cavalry coming back from a cavalry charge, both British and French, the 71st catch up. So they're all in line by the time they get to that point there. But I'm jumping ahead slightly there. One of the things we have a question mark over is how they formed their 4-deep line. If you look to the left, Leake and Gawler claim that basically the left wing was put behind the right wing. So they were still in 2-deep line and they actually formed 2 lines by putting the one wing in behind the other. This makes it interesting because if they did that, Anderson, which is number 5 company, becomes the pivot company when they do the 90-degree turn. I'll mention him again in a second. Colborne and Rowan, who were actually the 2 seniors, actually say, no, they weren't. They were in 4-deep line by company. We put the left half of the company behind the right half of the company to keep the order of 1 to 10. And it therefore makes it that Anderson is number 5, is in the middle. Now, why is that important? Well, when they do the 90-degree turn, they turn on the left company. They form the left company. It has to be the one that forms up. But at the same time, Colborne realizes he wants to put some skirmishers out and he orders Anderson's company forward as skirmishers. So if Anderson goes in this formation, you've actually taken your pivoting company out of the position to go and skirmish when you're in the middle of doing your 90-degree turn. Whereas in this formation, they turn on Sheddon's and Anderson's can be released from the center of the column without any problem, which hints, I'll come back to it again later, but it hints that Colborne and Rowan could be right and Leake and Gawler are mistaken. So we get into the final attack. Now, we know eventually that Detmer's troops get involved with these grenadiers here and they filter off in this direction over towards the east of the battlefield. So they come out of the story. Having defeated the Imperial Guard, as I say, Leake would say the 52nd, but in fact the entire Adams Brigade actually arrive at the road somewhere to the south of La Haye-Sainte, not at the orchard, but they mention a copse. So there must have been, although I can't find any map that shows it, but there must have been a wooden copse somewhere in this area here. And this area here, in fact, is where the road today still cuts through. There's a real deep cutting because that's where the forward ridge is, where some people have tried to claim that the actual French guns were on this side of the road during the actual Grand Battery. I'll talk about it in a second now. But that, with them crossing the road, the entire brigade crosses the road and lines this side with therefore the actual 71st forming up on this side here. So the 52nd are out here somewhere forming full line and before they move forward. This allows for Vivian's and Vandeleur's cavalry, when they charge, to charge straight through forward. There's nothing in their way. The only troops that are out there, in fact, is the Osnabrück battalion, who actually take the more direct route straight forward instead of crossing the road. So, sorry, apologies for this sort of plan, but it's a bit complicated, but let's see it. As you can see now, I end up with the Light Brigade arriving at the point where La Belle Alliance is, where the road is there, where the battery is, if you want to call it the Grand Battery. I say it's there because the Light Division have actually just crossed the road at the ravine. They've actually gone across it at that deep point where it goes back, and they actually say they have to go down a deep channel and back up the other side. When they come up the other side, do they find any abandoned guns? No, they find nothing there. They don't mention any guns. Where they mention finding guns is actually at the line here, where I believe obviously the guns were throughout the period, and they capture abandoned artillery here. So to the other side of the road, you have by this stage, as they arrive here, they can see Vivian's and Vandeleur's cavalry attacking on that side, and we know that in that area as well, that about that time was actually the German battalion as well, under Halkett as well, which actually turns up at this period, because they've come by a more direct route. They all arrive at this point around about the same time. As they move south now and they keep driving forward, the Guard battalions, and there are 3. Now, it's very difficult to be certain who the third one was, but there's certainly the 2 first Grenadiers were here, but who the third one is quite difficult to be certain who it was. But there was they keep going on about a third square in this area of Guard, but they slowly move back, and as they move back, all of these troops march after them, and they keep moving forward. They then pass this lane. Now, this lane actually still exists. I will show it to you now. That's the picture of the famous scene of them capturing these artillery trying to leave, with Plancenoit in the background. Actually, the church of Plancenoit wouldn't have been there. They'd been over here somewhere. They got their perspectives wrong on that. But that is the lane today. It still exists, and it runs up to the position where the Wounded Eagle monument is there now. Okay? There's a road that runs off to the left. If you actually go that side of the road, there is a lane, but it is so badly overgrown, you'd actually hardly notice it was actually there. It's only further down it becomes obvious in the fields. But that's the lane where they actually overran the battery and captured a battery of guns at that point. They then continued forcing the pace back, and they passed Rosson Farm, and as they get to the hamlet of Maison-du-Roi, which exists today, they encamp in this area here. And that's quite important, because they arrive here and they guesstimate this arrival at around about 9:15. Once they get there, that's them finished for the night. They encamp here. Obviously, other troops come up and sort of embark at this point here. But there is one major point I'll bring up, is that obviously some of the Prussians come in this direction, but they don't mention any of those appearing at this stage. What they do mention is the first arrival of the Prussians from Plancenoit on this road here that comes in. And in fact, it's still there today. In the middle of Maison-du-Roi, you can turn right into the Ligny Valley. They come in on this road, and as they come past, they actually see the Brits here, and obviously sort of start cheering them and everything else on the win. What time do they arrive? Now, we know the fighting here is all over by about 9 o'clock, because it started about 8 o'clock with the fighting over the other side, and by 9 o'clock, 9:15, the 52nd are here. So we know the rout has started before 9 o'clock. The Prussians arrive here to the 52nd, and Leake says this, but not only Leake, but even Holman, who actually wrote it in his diary on the night, says they arrived at 9:45, half an hour after we arrived. which is quite interesting because we know Plancenoit is down here, and it's about a half an hour march from Plancenoit to this point. But if all of this broke down at 9 o'clock, why is it they're not at this road point until 9:15? Sorry, 9:45. It seems as if, one, they clearly didn't get to this area with the main road until much later than perhaps some people claim. But it also means that perhaps having finally pushed the French out of Plancenoit, because the 52nd see no Frenchmen go charging past them at this stage from this area. They don't, they don't see anybody for a while. When the Prussians arrived, they must have actually formed up, which would make sense, before they marched forward again. Perhaps having got through Plancenoit, they reformed before they moved forward. But there's a good half an hour between the Brits saying they arrived here and the Prussians arriving. Now, I want to mention a couple of things about casualties, and the only reason this is quite, it would perhaps get you completely if you read this too much, but down the sides here, we've got the numbers. Around 210 men were either killed or wounded in the battle, which is a relatively low figure. It's about 20% of the figures, because in fact, obviously, as I say, they weren't under fire much until 4 or 5 o'clock. But as you can see, killed in action and the wounded who died of their wounds is about 24%. And those who were wounded and invalided is 20%, and wounded and recovered nearly 60%. And it's quite interesting that these figures tie almost exactly with the returns that Mick Crumplin and I did in the book a couple of years ago now on the hospitals after Waterloo, in saying that, in fact, 60% of your wounded generally tended to come back and join you after the actual action at some stage, whereas we perhaps tend to assume, killed and wounded, most of them are gone forever. It's a high proportion come back to the actual battalion in time. And as you can see by the companies, there is actually, this is the company's casualties in total line. You can see there's not a huge difference between any of them. The only one that's a bit taller, a bit more than the others at 14% is actually Anderson, because Anderson's the one that went out to skirmishes. And we know that, and therefore they probably took a bit more fire. But what it does show, and I'll show it on the next screen as well, is if you look at the other companies, there's not a lot of inconsistency between them. There's, they're pretty average figures, which means that, again, in this situation, it is more likely that they formed up in this way, as Colborne said, which is half a company behind the other. Because if you look at number 7 and number 6 company, for example, if they advanced against the Guards in this formation, these two companies have got much lower casualty rates than Rowan and Chalmers. So why would that happen if they were behind? It's more likely they were in this formation because they're in the center of the organization and they take the highest casualties instead. So again, it does appear that that's where we are with that. Now, I'll go past that because I can see time is moving on. I'll just mention a couple of things here now. This is when they're actually on the move from Waterloo to Paris. There are actually 19 desertions. During the march to Waterloo, around about 8 members of the organization, either of the 52nd, either desert or fall by the wayside for other reasons. 2 are classed as sick, most are deserters, and most of them missed the Battle of Waterloo. But then on the way to Paris, and yes, some of the marches were quite hard, but there were 19 desertions that we know during that period. And we know the companies generally, and in fact, Patrick Campbell's comes out to this, as you can see, as nearly half of all of them, but perhaps mates going together, I don't know, although they did actually desert on different days, some of them. But 19 is quite a high number of desertions on that march to Paris. And as I said, what I then looked at is also the whole year by desertions. So from December 1814 to 1815, as you can see, to see if there was a bit of consistency with Patrick Campbell's company being bad again. And this time, funny enough, Patrick Campbell's is very low if you look at that period. If you take the Paris bit out, in fact, it's other companies that have the problem. So there is no consistency there, to say the least. Now, when they're in Paris, this is another report from Clinton, and I'll only mention the black bit again. I just want to mention very quickly, because you can see that they were, he actually says that if they'd been employed in actually attacking any of the fortresses on the way down from Waterloo, that they wouldn't have been very good troops for doing so, because he says the authority of the officers is not good, and therefore the soldiers have got too much laxity of discipline, which is very disgusting. That's quite strong words. So he's really saying if they'd had to take on any of the fortresses, he wouldn't have used them. He then goes on to say the 52nd has seen to great disadvantage under Sir John Colborne because he knows nothing of manoeuvring and seems to hire himself against gaining any information or instruction from a superior officer. That means he's not listening to him. Now you think, okay, this is Clinton. He's a bit of a stickler for this stuff. But General Adam also does a report in October. Now, please don't even read all that. It's just way too long. But basically it says lots of good stuff, very active, very zealous, lots of good officers, men are pretty respectable, their privates are well organized, etc. But at the end of it, he says a couple of things. First of all, the number of court martials at 90 is very considerable. It is, if you look at most other battalions of this period. And Sir John Colborne governs his regiment with a firm hand, but has an inclination to deviate from established rules. That means he doesn't always give them the flogging they deserve, and a desire to be independent of his superior officers. That's particularly the cause why an exclusive spirit exists in the battalion. But then he says, finally, Sir John Colborne is not very expert drill. So again, you've got somebody questioning in their drill and abilities from Colborne himself. It's quite surprising. So there's a number of court martials, as you can see. Patrick Campbell's is quite high if you look at all of them, and it seems part of the reason why. But there are actually 124 in that year, which is actually a lot higher than even the 90s that Adam mentions. I only want to very briefly mention something else, and I'll finish. One of the officers, Lieutenant Shaw, says that Colonel Colborne was too quick to say to the soldiers, so I won't actually punish you, I will actually let you away with the punishment, just don't do it again type stuff, remitting the public punishment. When Rowan was in charge, he didn't do that. He would always, this is what Shaw says, he says the first couple of offences, he would always give them the full flogging, and then after time, you would notice that the soldiers didn't act so badly in the future. And I thought, can we prove this? Well, I looked at the actual years, and if you look at it here, you can see there's 124 court-martials in 1815, and you can see half a year is commanded by each of them. But 77% of those punishments were remitted. In 1816, there were only 25. Colonel Rowan was in charge. In 1817, only 18, and there was Colonel Rowan in charge. And you think, okay, well, it's not the battle period, it's not the march to Paris, so there's not so many times to be a problem. But then Colonel Rowan is in charge for half a year, and then Colonel Colborne comes back from his holidays because he'd been on the Grand Tour, and suddenly they go back up to 33. And I thought, is there any way of showing that there is some statement of what Shaw is saying is correct? And there is. Because if you split the 2 years that we've noticed there's the two of them doing this, in the first half of 1815, there were only 2 court-martials when Rowan was in charge, and he did remit both of them. So, okay, fine. But there were 122 under Colborne, and he remitted 77. So, okay, you can say that year, with everything was going on with the battle, etc., maybe there's excuses. But in the 1818 one, Rowan only gets 7, and he only remits 2. As soon as Colborne comes back, it triples, and you get a lot more instances of actually soldiers breaking the rules when there's absolutely no reason for that to have happened. And as you can see, his percentage of actual remittances goes up dramatically. So his policy of remittance doesn't seem to have worked, and Shaw is right in saying that that didn't work as well as Rowan's rule of, no, the first few people that do it, they'll get the message that I mean it, and you'll get the full lash. And then after that, it stepped back, and it did work. So to sum up now for a second, to say that basically I just wanted to bring up, and obviously the book, which is 300 odd pages, has got a huge amount more information I can actually impart at this stage here, and probably I've said too much now. But for those who are still managing to listen to me and haven't fallen off asleep or anything yet, basically the 52nd did do some great stuff on the day. They actually had a great effect during the cavalry charges, and they clearly had a major impact on the Guard attacks, or at least part of the Guard attacks. The problem is for the 52nd is, yes, they didn't get as much notice afterwards, but they didn't start fighting that battle afterwards until many years later. Gawler's 15 years later, sorry. Leake is arguing 40 years after the event, when he didn't even have notes at the time of the battle, even himself, is arguing these things, when most people, you know, it's all over and done with. You can't change history by this stage. Even Lucy Worsley will actually tell you that in her sort of latest sort of things. But those facts stand, and obviously the 52nd did a very good job. But at the end of the day, they were part of a combined operation, where the Guards and certainly some of the Belgians were involved in actually defeating the Guard, and they deserve to have actually had more praise, but their arguments by Leake particularly ended up sort of trying to denigrate everybody else's part in the battle, and that doesn't work either. And I think basically, yes, they should have got more support and more praise, but unfortunately their arguments didn't do them any favors afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gareth. Brilliant, as always, and a fantastic amount of detail, and so well presented you can actually picture it in your own mind as you're going through it. Very, very good indeed. So if you'd like to, that's it, stop sharing, and we'll go. Lots of very positive comments on the chat.
Oh, they're still awake then?
Yes, oh yes, yes, yes. Yeah, yeah. Right, let's go through them. There's, because there's quite a few for Sue, which I'll go over. I've been through rather. So from Vincent Gray, a lovely dawn, beautiful orange sky to the east, but no sun yet. That's because he's in Canada, and we asked him what the weather was in Canada.
Oh, right, okay. I did wonder why you're getting the weather for.
Yes. Brilliant detail and research, Gareth. This is from Brian, just as we've come to expect. Superb. Colin, as always, excellent research, Gareth. Many thanks. From Dave B. Gareth, thanks for a really informative talk. And where can I find your podcast? But John has already answered that, as usual, efficiently. The podcast is on our Waterloo Association website, Members Zone. This is where we'll place this podcast once we've topped and tailed it. From Vic Powell, cheers, Gareth, great work, sir. From Richard Baker, for a new member, I found the presentation very detailed indeed. Gareth has huge depth of knowledge on the subject. From David Harris, very comprehensive and detailed account. Good to see somebody hasn't wasted lockdown.
This was written before lockdown. Books take a while to come out.
Question, right. Blucher from Martin Davis. Blucher and the Prussians met Wellington near La Belle Alliance, but was that earlier than 945 and further north than the Prussians from Plastner?
Well, that's a good question. Did Blucher actually meet him there? Yeah. There's a lot of talk to say that he actually met him a lot further south than that, and that it just happened to be a good place to say that you'd had an alliance meet together at the end of a battle, isn't it? So it became a bit of a folklore. But Wellington said it happened there, but and then at other times he said it happened much further south of that. And in fact, there's quite a bit of evidence in the 52nd book, which I've mentioned in the book, that Wellington had gone further south when the 52nd stopped, and as Blucher and his Prussians came into that road on the left there, it's highly likely that Wellington and Blucher sort of met somewhere south of that position on the road down that way, because that's in fact the way the Blucher came. He didn't go to La Belle Alliance. There was no reason for him to go to Belle Alliance. The French were already fleeing, and he wanted to actually follow them on the other road. So he took a different road to the main road from there. So it didn't happen then. It happened later, in fact, and probably well south of that.
Okay, good. Thank you. From David Burden, great presentation. Love the clarity of the maps. Thank you, Gareth. Martin Davis, superb. Gareth. Maxine Hawkins, outstanding. Thank you so much. Rowan, fantastic talk. Thanks, Gareth. Peter Malloy, many thanks to Sue and Gareth and to all involved in organising. Really interesting morning of talks. From Andrew, thank you to Sue and Gareth for amazing and informative talks. Neil Carey, thanks, Gareth. It would be great to replicate your detailed analysis for other battalions. Well, you've got lots.
Yeah, okay.
I'll have to buy the book to discover your method. Oh, he's talking about other people doing it as well. Great.
Oh, that's all right. Good. I'm glad for that.
Yeah, MP Greenwood, looking forward to republishing. Many thanks. Robert Pocock, many thanks, Ian, John, Sue and Gareth, a great event. From Ian Chard, excellent detail. It helps my research on a private who served in McNair's company. Thanks, Gareth. When will the book be published?
It's out last month. It's called The Great Waterloo Controversy. Actually, I forgot to put the last slide on, which had them on there. If I hold that to the screen, maybe you can see it.
Yes, yeah. Okay.
It's available from all good bookshops and Amazon if you want to.
Yeah, okay. From Hembo, Steve Hemmings, thanks to Gareth for an excellent and brilliant research lecture. Just a note on the fog of war and adding to being unable to differentiate between grenadiers and chasseurs. I took part in the 2015 reenactment with just 5,500 troops on the field. Towards the end of the battle, only 2 hours, there was a considerable amount of smoke on the field. So much I felt sorry for the paying spectators. From Neil Carey, doesn't your timing support the argument the French army was beaten on their left well before Zetin's corps broke them near Papelot?
No, they would have been pushed back from Papelot by this stage. I mean, they would have been being pushed back along that road, basically, towards La Belle Alliance. But clearly, they had not got anywhere close to La Belle Alliance when this brigade obviously arrives here, because they don't see any Prussians at that stage. They see some Prussians later with captured horses, in fact, buy a few captured horses off them. But yeah, the timing is quite difficult, but certainly there's, the evidence is that the French line on the right had started to buckle as well, but not to the same extent. What this evidence is helping to prove in some ways is that, the defeat of the Imperial Guard and the buckling of the French left was the real start of the rout.
Okay, great. And I think that's it.